Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Hannah Habermann and Jesse Bryant. They are the podcast producers of Yonder Lies, Unpacking the Myths of Jackson Hole. Welcome, Hannah and Jesse.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Emmy.
Well, congratulations, first of all, for getting an expansion grant.
Mm-hmm.
And
Thank you.
Yeah, and being able to continue on your great work that you're doing. And I want to know, what was the inspiration to create this podcast?
Totally. I think that's a great question. I think, and maybe I can only speak for myself here, but as someone who grew up in the West in Montana and then spent some time away, I just realized how often stories about this region, and particularly Jackson Hole, are really steeped in kind of these superficial myths or just like stories that only skim the surface. And Jackson is such a complicated and interesting place in terms of all these intersections of people and the environment and politics and different ideas about what it means to be part of this community. And yeah, at some point it just felt like exploring that deeper and trying to add more nuance was unavoidable and just felt really exciting, and has been both an awesome learning process for myself as well as I'm sure for Jesse, and has just been cool to start more conversations and just have more people be interested about what is underneath the surface here.
When you look at what's underneath the surface, how did you start coming up with your podcast titles and subjects? What was the driving force behind what do you think people are interested in?
Hannah, do you want to talk about the title of the podcast? Because there's like a very specific story about where the podcast name came from.
Yeah, I can share about that. And then maybe Jesse, you can dive into a little bit about the process of winnowing down what we wanted to explore. But, we'd been thinking about doing this project. We were like, okay, first things first, we should come up with a name. Because that felt like sort of the low hanging fruit. And I don't know, we were throwing around different ideas that, I don't know, in retrospect, were pretty lackluster. Just like exploring Jackson Hole. And yeah, so there's a sign at the top of Teton Pass. That's pretty iconic. There are always people up there taking pictures with it. I think it has like a figure of a cowboy pointing into the valley. And when we were talking about it, I was like, I'm pretty sure it says Yonder Lies. And like, what a great sort of double meaning of like, okay, we're just gesturing to the town of Jackson. And also it has this other meaning of, lies in the context of maybe myths and diving under the surface. And then it was funny because we went up there to look at it and the sign actually says, what does it say, Jess?
I think it says Yonder is.
Yeah. So even totally. And even the fact that I thought it was Yonder Lies and sort of this like archaic Old West language was in itself not correct. So it's kind of a funny little anecdote, but we liked it. And I was like, someone's going to call us out on it, that it's like not actually really what the sign says. But yeah, it was a great name. And I think it served us well.
Well, I agree with you that it plays on those words. And I think that because obviously you both love history, right? You have to love history in order to think about this anyway, and think about what are the myths. And I love that you took that word and said, okay, because what is the truth? What is existing out there that people believe, but maybe is not for real? Mm-hmm. So what do you think about that, Jesse?
Well, I think that was kind of we have been trying to do with this podcast, and honestly I've been getting better at through the process of making it, is when we talk about myths in our podcast, Yonder Lies, I think we're talking about it in a slightly different way than I think the sort of colloquial myth idea of like a necessarily false story. And when we're operating sort of in our podcast, we're taking these myths at face value and not being like, oh, that's a myth and that's not a myth, like to say, oh, that's true or this is false, but looking at them at face value and asking, which stories about this place. So which ways that people are understanding what this place is about? What is Jackson Hole? How should I live here? How do I fit into this community? Which of those stories is like useful or maybe true? And which are just kind of like totally off the mark? Because there's some stories and things, ways of understanding Jackson and Jackson Hole and the history that are like pretty true. Like there's a deep history of conservation here. The whole like story about this is a place where people are into conservation is like largely true. But then there's other stories about what Jackson is that make that hypocritical, and the way that people understand place. I think our intent, and sort of your question about what were our intentions underneath the surface, were to sort of, ask which stories are useful, which stories are not useful or problematic for certain reasons, and just try to cut through the sort of, superficial understanding of Jackson as a place where you're in like the Old West, which is just not really the case, as I'm sure you know, as someone who lives in Jackson,
I could consider that true and false, because I think there's a lot of people who are considered quote unquote old timers who feel like this is still the Old West. They still are ranching. They're still moving cattle. They're still living off their land. So I think that is that intersection of, more, newer people that come in who have not understood the West. I think that's the big love of the West, is that people still do those things here. But yet,
But yet it's the wealthiest county in the United States.
Right. So we have those two really different ways of thinking about life in Jackson. So what are the 3 themes that you chose for this next series that you got a grant for? So
I think our last 3 episodes, what we applied for the expansion grant for, were to cover bear euthanization, which we did I think our longest episode that we've done on, and released it a couple weeks ago. And then we are currently in the process of making an episode that Hannah is totally leading the charge on about, and this is particularly, this is going to be an episode that cuts through sort of a very false myth, I think, about Jackson, about the Latinx community in Jackson, which is an enormous part of Jackson Hole. And I think most of the time when folks think about a place like Jackson Hole, they don't consider that 30% of the population is not white. And then the last episode that we're going to do is sort of about the future of Jackson Hole. We're going to look at what climate models are predicting, what population growth models are predicting, we're going to interview a bunch of random people and see just sort of where they think Jackson's going to be in 50 years, see what people imagine Jackson to look like as it evolves forward.
What have you learned about the Latino community, Hannah?
Yeah, I think it's, obviously a very multifaceted community. And I think, as Jesse said, just first addressing this, what I understand to be an overarching assumption around most people, both tourists and a lot of folks who live here, where, people are quick to say, oh, Jackson is a super white town, and there's not a lot of diversity here. And if you look at certain parts of Jackson and walk in certain circles, I think that is what you see. And I think the overarching intention of this episode is to complicate that and add nuance to that, and also ask, why do people think that? And the reality of the fact is that so much of Jackson's infrastructure is supported by this Latinx community, whether that is in construction, whether that's in landscaping, whether that is in hotels or the resorts. And often, people focus on the mountain or focus on the restaurants. And this is pervasive, everywhere in the US, but we don't look at those essential workers. And in a lot of ways, it's been interesting to just learn about how COVID in some ways has heightened people's awareness of the most vulnerable members of our community and helped people, I think, through the incredible amount of support that was given to 122 and continues to be given to 122 to redistribute to folks who maybe either didn't have access to federal stimulus checks or are just much more unstable in terms of economics. People are like, oh, white folks in Jackson who perhaps live in a certain bubble are saying, oh, okay, like I need to think more critically about this community. And I think it's been really amazing to learn, just more about what this place means to folks in the Latinx community and the overlap in terms of this whitewashed way in which we think about people interacting here, whether that's hiking or fishing or just enjoying this space and seeing it as a place where you can raise a family and enjoy being outside. Yeah. And then you can add the whole other layer of, national politics and thinking about immigration and thinking about, as the West continues to diversify, what that means for people in Jackson and the Latinx community. So much to dig into. And it's been a really, really fun episode to research and think about. And I'm excited to see what we can come up with.
Where can people find these episodes?
All of our podcasts are available on iTunes, so Apple Podcasts, and also Spotify as well. And you can stream them there.
My last question to both of you, and you can think about how and what have you learned through this process? Not just how you've learned to do the podcast in and of itself, but also what you've learned that has surprised you about the subjects that you've covered.
I can go first. I think when I was in grad school, I moved from Jackson to study environmental management. And one of the first professors I had was Susan Clark, who is a longtime Jackson resident. And I went to school and I remember being in her class and we were talking one of the first days about environmental management broadly. And she said this thing that I've repeated on the podcast before, but it's taken a while for it to sink in, which is that environmental problems don't exist. They're all human problems. In the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it's so clear if you step back for a second that humans are the biggest impact and that we need to learn to manage people. And that takes understanding people and understanding motivations and understanding myths and stories and perspectives. And that has become very true to me through this process. And I think that I've become more focused through this podcast on how do we make decisions together? How do we learn to understand each other better? How do we understand, what is motivating people here? And we need to really, from my perspective, to reach any environmental sort of like goal, we need to first understand ourselves. And I think that's what's sort of inspired this podcast, but I think has become more true to me through the process of looking at all of these different conflicts, whether it's bighorn sheep and mountain goat management, bear euthanization, whatever. It's really about people.
How about you, Hannah? What have you learned creating this podcast?
One thing that really sticks out to me is just how much of a exciting and growth-filled process it can be to just really dive into learning about a place. And I think how much curiosity and just wanting to dive deeper and deeper, committing to that can be. And I've certainly felt that in producing this podcast, and I hope that our listeners have felt that as well. And I think once you, start tugging on one thing or becoming curious about one thing, you realize that it's all super interconnected. And every day that we work on this project, I feel like one small piece of a painting is becoming clarified for me. And I feel so passionate about wanting to better understand the whole picture. And obviously my whole picture might inherently look different from someone else's whole picture. And I think I feel very inspired to integrate in my life a love of just learning about place and seeing that as essential to my identity. And I hope through this podcast that maybe a bigger piece of the character of Jackson can just be people being curious about this place and wanting to know more and tugging on those little pieces and uncovering more of the painting for themselves. And I think that spirit of curiosity and adventure honestly translates really well to Jackson's spirit. So it's been really wonderful to participate in that.
Well, tell me again how people can find you.
Jesse, you want to give it a go?
Sure. Well, we're on Instagram and Facebook at Yonder Lies Pod. And we're on Apple Podcasts, totally searchable, just in the podcast store area. And we're on Spotify and any other streaming service that people use. We're on iHeartRadio. I don't know. We're on all the things.
You're everywhere. You're everywhere. Okay.
If you Google us, you'll find us for sure.
So if you Google Yonder Lies,
Unpacking the Myths of Jackson. If you Google Yonder Lies now, we're the first thing that comes up. So that's been an uphill battle that we've totally won.
Yay! Well, it's been great talking to you.
You too, Emmy.
Thank you so much for having us, Emmy.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.